I wanted to start, we've got HITRUST Secrets, but I also wanted to start kind of a series called HITRUST Basics. So we can kind of go through some of those just basic blocking and tackling about HITRUST. And
I
so
like that idea.
this
I
is
like
part of
that.
the first of that series. It's a little bit jumping ahead because it's surviving an interim assessment, which an interim assessment would mean you've done an R2, which is a 2-year assessment.
Yep.
You've successfully gotten certified and you're at that 1-year anniversary mark. And so that's what an interim assessment is. There's for an E1 and an I1, there's also a rapid recertification because those are both 1-year certifications. Those are a little bit different. Donna's actually going through one of those right now, so hopefully we can have her share her experience with a rapid recertification. I've not gone through that, so I don't want to speak to a rapid recert as opposed to an interim. So,
Uh, I'm going to go on mute here in a second
okay.
as you give a presentation, but you said something that caught my attention, and I want to. This is a recert,
Mhm.
but it's locations.
It,
Did I?
it, some in some cases you can like for this particular, most of the time your hosting environment doesn't change in those
Right.
2 years. But in this
Yep.
particular case, they did. They moved from a co-location that was hosting their systems to a cloud hosting
Yep.
environment.
I
And
like
so
that.
yeah, so it was a little bit of a, okay, the scope hasn't changed, the systems didn't change. What they were actually the technology that they customized and were implementing hadn't changed. It was just where it was operating
Okay.
had changed. Backups stayed the same and all of that. So that was why to me it was like, oh, okay, I think we can do this, and it was a matter of talking with HITRUST support and saying, okay, this is what's changed, and so we'll go through that. But
Okay.
for all interim assessments, they come at the 1-year anniversary, and really it's a way for HITRUST to just check in and make sure that they're not letting a certification go for 2 full years. Because in technology speak, 2 years is a really long time. So 120 days before your anniversary date. So everything's focused on that 1-year anniversary date. 120 days before that, if you've got a HITRUST subscription, you can actually generate the interim assessment, which sometimes can be helpful to be 4 months early, especially if you've got, something going that would take your attention off of the certification or this interim certification effort. 90 days before that 1-year anniversary, if you haven't already generated your assessment, HITRUST will do it for you automatically. So it's kind of a nice reminder. So even if you forget, you're going to get a notification from HITRUST, hey, we've created your interim assessment. And that's really when the clock starts ticking. And you've got up until the day of that 1-year anniversary date to submit all of your evidence. But it's really important that you have to submit it on or before that 1-year anniversary date. If you wait and you think you can have like a week or two, then your certification is in jeopardy because you really need to focus on that 1-year certification date. All right, so in a typical interim assessment, you will have 19 controls that will be evaluated. There's one randomly selected from each of the HITRUST domains. So even if like domain 11, which is identity and access management, those are usually huge numbers of controls. There'll still only be one that will be selected from that domain. So it'll cover each one of those 19 domains. If you have any corrective action plans, any of the controls that are associated with those corrective actions would also be included in your assessment. So you may have one corrective action plan that's covering 2 or 3 controls. Those 2 or 3 controls will also be added to your interim assessment. So typically we always say the interim is 19 controls and any corrective actions that you may have. So it can vary on how big or small of an effort it would be based on that caps. So you can kind of gauge from that. Um, these are the first 3 questions that your validated assessor is going to ask you during the interim. First and foremost, have you had any security breaches? Because answering yes to that is going to require a better level of scrutiny. HITRUST would need to get involved. If it's something that hasn't made the news, It's something that, you need to report to your assessor. It's not necessarily a showstopper, but it may require additional controls added to the interim assessment.
A material fact.
Exactly. Exactly. So, the last thing you want is high trust coming to you to say, "Hey, we need to double check your certification status because the breach has reached national news level." But even if it doesn't reach national news level, you still have that responsibility to explain to your auditor and report back to high trust what that security breach was. Based on the interim control testing, this is a quote that the external assessor is needing to say thumbs up or thumbs down. But is the external assessor aware of any reason to revoke the certification? So again, that's your validated assessor having that conversation with you to say, well, how are the controls working? What has, maybe it wasn't a security breach, but there's been other problems or questions that have come up. And then here's where, it was a little bit interesting for me for this interim assessment that I just did, but have any significant changes occurred in policies or processes, the controls themselves, hosting locations, or technologies? And again, it's not necessarily a showstopper. Maybe you had one backup solution and now you've moved to a different backup solution. And so your technology has changed. You're still backing up your systems, you still have immutable backups, but those are controls that HITRUST may want to include to have them reevaluated, new evidence gathered, et cetera. And then for like mine was a hosting location had changed. So you're not allowed to add systems. You're not allowed to add more functionality technology to it. It's still the same scope, the same network diagram, data flow diagram, et cetera. But they are allowing for some changes to happen in that 1 year time period. But I
I,
know this is
I
where Donna would kind of come in and go, so understanding that it's coming up at the 1 year anniversary, if you've got something that, maybe you're planning on a change, you may want to plan it after your 1 year anniversary to be implemented. And that way you can honestly say nothing's changed. You do your interim assessment and then you make the changes. And then when you're ready for your next year certification, you've got those controls in place for a nice long time. So that's where we've always talked about timing is everything when it comes to these. So in addition to the 19 controls and then any controls for the corrective actions, additional controls may be added if there are changes. If you answered anything on that in that third question, including hosting location and then technologies. So I think we touched on that already. So other things that I learned along the way, the strategies for success, probably the easiest thing for those controls that you're looking at is to go back to the original assessment and see what evidence you provided for that original assessment and then refresh that evidence. So, make sure your policies, if they were reviewed a month before your last assessment, make sure that they've been reviewed again, that, in the current year. And then just look, and say, okay, this particular piece of evidence satisfied this control a year ago. Let me just get a new screenshot, an updated version of that audit log or whatever it is, and include that. We had this question that came up last week because we were talking about external inheritance for a rapid recertification. The first assessor in the original assessment didn't take full advantage of external inheritance. And so Donna had asked the question, she's like, is it going to, raise any kind of flags during a rapid recert if instead of only having 4 controls that have external inheritance, if I, have now 100 controls that have external inheritance? And it wasn't because anything changed in the environment. It was just the assessor's perspective on, using external inheritance versus maybe reliance on a control. So my advice for an interim assessment, because it's an R2 and you really want to keep everything the same, is keep those external inheritance percentages the same. Unless something like I did, which, going from a co-location to cloud hosting, there were a lot of those that were 100% inherited, especially physical controls that we may have, the colo may have allowed you in to do, some of that physical security. and your cloud hosting provider will not allow you any of those physical security controls. So in that case, you can. But for the most part, I would say if you had external inheritance percentages, keep those the way they were. Um, and then if the control was scored, score it again. So what I mean by that is if you marked it and you scored it before, don't think maybe this time I can put it as not applicable. Um, because that actually came up as a red flag for a couple of the ones. I had one that I had scored that was scored last year that I marked as not applicable because to me it was more the applicability of it. It wasn't something that was tested. It was just something that to me not applicable was a better fit than 100% because there's zero population.
So how did they come back to you, Sue?
There's QA tasks. So the same as when after you submit your certification or your external assessor submits it to HITRUST, they go through
Okay.
a QA process. And so during that QA process, they'll flag some things and then send those back as questions to say, well, how come, a year ago it was marked this way and now you're marking it this way? And so we came back with, well, instead of a zero population, it really is not applicable. And they were like, no, for the interim, mark it this way. And then
Okay.
maybe a year from now, we might mark it not applicable. But that was definitely a lesson learned for me. And vice versa. If it was marked not applicable, don't go back and say, oh, well, it actually is applicable. Just if they said it was not applicable and they pulled that one, which I don't think happens very often. I don't think that they typically will pull a not applicable as something to review during an interim assessment. But if they were to do that and it was not applicable in the prior one, just leave it not applicable again.
I think I hear you saying keep everything the same.
Yes,
If,
and that's really what high trust is looking for is everything the same.
yeah.
So,
Okay.
especially when it comes to scoring and things like that. And
Yeah.
again, I mean, if maybe you were 75% uh, scored the year prior, and now you do have a process, maybe you were missing a procedure, and now you have a documented procedure, you can definitely increase the score. And then you can add that new evidence to say, hey, we improved it, especially during like your
Yeah.
corrective action plans, and anything that maybe had a corrective action plan. But by and large, just go with the evidence that you had last year, just refresh it for this year, and then move on. Because you really are trying to prove not necessarily that you've improved things, but that you've at least kept the same level of
Yes.
security.
Yeah.
The only place you're trying to show that you've improved things is in your corrective actions, any of those controls that required corrective actions. And that's one of the things HITRUST is going to look at is to see that you've made some sort of, not necessarily everything's completed, but that you've made progress towards those corrective actions. And I always caution people when you're going through that next year certification effort again, one of the first things HITRUST is going to look at is, well, what did you fail 2 years ago? And
Yeah.
they're going to make sure that you're not continuing that, especially if you put a corrective action plan in saying, yeah, I've fixed it. Well, you certainly aren't going to revert back and not have it in place again.
Hmm.
And then really the resource that I use all the time is that assessment handbook. And it goes through step by step. As a matter of fact, I had a copy of it here, but it goes through step by step your interim assessment workflow here. And then it'll talk even about what is a significant change. So it talks through exactly what the process is, for this. But that's just a high level review of
I
what an
like it.
interim assessment is.
I like it a lot. That was
Perfect.
actually very helpful.
Oh,
So
good. Good.
thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode of High Trust Basics. If you got value out of this, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you have questions and want to go deeper on this topic, join us every Thursday for HITRUST Secrets. Thanks for watching.